Welcome back. If you are taking this lesson or listening to this lesson in my course, we are at the end of the semester. We have reached the point in human evolution where people have become anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens. The next kind of big leap in this journey is discovering food production, and that's what we're going to talk about in this lesson. This lesson is about the first farmers, subsistence, and how the transition from foraging to food production affected human biology and evolution. So, depending on what textbook you're using, we might be talking about adaptive strategies or subsistence. Subsistence is just a way that people get their food, and these are also called adaptive strategies. So, there are different methods or modes of subsistence, and again, these can also be called adaptive strategies. They're the same thing, but the way people get their food is an adaptive strategy, so I hope that makes sense. And I said this already, but these topics are included within the infrastructure or economy of a society. So an economy is a cultural adaptation to the environment. Just to review, a culture is a system of shared beliefs, ideas, behaviors, and institutions in a society. A cultural adaptation is a set of ideas, activities, and technologies that enable a group of humans to use their basic needs or to meet their basic needs, and if it is organized well, the adaptation will allow the population to thrive. So every society has to adapt to its environment in different ways. Since we are humans, we are often using culture rather than instinct. So an economic system is a pattern of relationships and institutions that humans construct to help collectively meet the needs of the community. Anthropologist Yehudi Cohen refers to an economy as a set of adaptive strategies that humans have used to provide food, water, and shelter to a group of people through the production, distribution, and consumption of foodstuffs and other goods. There are 5 adaptive strategies, and these are also called types of subsistence, as I mentioned earlier: food foraging, pastoralism, which is raising domesticated animals, horticulture, which is similar to gardening, involves growing plant foods with simple hand tools without using fertilizer. Horticulture also incorporates fallowing periods where plots are left alone to become overgrown with natural vegetation and regain soil fertility. Agriculture is different from horticulture. It uses more labor, uses land continuously, uses fertilizer and or irrigation and or draft animals for plowing and transportation of crops. And then finally, we get to the last method and the newest, industrial food production. So in food foraging societies, there are specific kind of sets of behaviors or characteristics that are often attached or come along with the fact that a society is food foraging. So oftentimes the method of subsistence will affect many other aspects of the culture. So we're going to talk about some general characteristics of food foraging societies, and when we understand that, we'll be able to contrast and more completely understand what would happen or what kind of a cultural shift this would be if societies started growing their own food instead of foraging for food. So again, we're going to talk about characteristics of food foraging societies, and these are mobility, so they don't stay in one place for very long. They're mobile or nomadic. There's a division of labor by gender. There are egalitarian social relations. Food is shared, and group sizes are small. The mobility of food foragers is strongly limited by the difficult living environments that they occupy. For instance, the distance between a foraging group's food supply and fresh water must not be so great that more energy is required to obtain fresh water than can be obtained from food. So this used to be the standard of how people got their food until food production or plant and animal domestication was discovered. People got their food from foraging, and they were limited by many factors. Now, there are still societies that use food foraging, but they are very marginalized. So in deserts or in the Arctic or regions that don't support plant and animal domestication. All societies have some type of division of labor by gender. Foraging groups follow these two patterns. Often, men are doing the hunting, the butchering, the processing of hard or tough materials, and overall more dangerous activities, and women are collecting food and doing domestic chores. Things like collecting water and firewood are also often women's work as well. Egalitarianism is an important characteristic among many food foraging societies. In an egalitarian society, members will have about equal rank, access to, and power over basic resources. Age and sex are usually the only sources of important status differences. No one member will accumulate more goods than another, thus eliminating jealousy and potential conflict. Another thing is that people are traveling nonstop. They can't really accumulate many material possessions because they're basically carrying everything on their backs as well. And they're living a lifestyle where there's not a lot of surplus and not a lot of accumulation of personal goods. Food foraging characteristics continued. Now we're moving on to food sharing. Men and women will both share the fruits of their labor. They each provide a different food resource that they continue to share with one another. Food sharing among members and other nearing groups can also provide the basis for creating and maintaining social allies and networks. So, another characteristic is small group size. I mentioned earlier, food foraging groups have limits on their populations due to the carrying capacities of the lands they inhabit. A carrying capacity is the amount of people the land can support with its available resources. And finally, going back to the small group size, one reason that population growth is limited in foraging groups is because of the prolonged nursing of infants. Nursing keeps mothers from ovulating, thus postponing subsequent pregnancies. Now, women can ovulate when breastfeeding, but it's much less common. So it's sort of like a natural birth control that's definitely not guaranteed, but it's far less likely that a woman will become pregnant while she's still nursing a baby. As well, the other limiting factor is lower percentages of body fat. Lower body fat leads to a later onset of ovulation and menstruation, thus postponing physical maturity and motherhood. So there are somewhat, you could call natural birth controls in place. Girls don't get their first menstruation until later because their body fat percentages are lower. As well, when a woman does have a child, she will nurse this child for 3 to 4 years, a long periods of time, which leads to a greater spacing between births. So these are other factors to keep in mind and to understand when we look into how food production or plant and animal domestication would have affected or caused a cultural and kind of lifestyle transition for people who carried this out.